A small canvas hangs in a quiet room at the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, and at first glance it asks almost nothing of the viewer. A patch of grass, a scatter of yellow flowers, a few green blades catching afternoon light, painted close enough that the ground fills the entire frame and the horizon disappears completely. Vincent van Gogh painted this in 1887, not long after he arrived in Paris, and for well over a century it was treated as one of his smaller, quieter works, the kind of painting a visitor walks past on the way to the sunflowers or the wheat fields. Nothing about the surface suggests it is hiding anything at all. The brushwork is loose and fast, the colors are bright and almost weightless, built from short strokes of green, ochre, and white that Van Gogh was still teaching himself to use in those first months in the city. There is no figure here, no obvious drama, nothing that reads as a mystery, and that is exactly what makes what lies beneath it so difficult to reconcile with what sits on top. Underneath this patch of grass, invisible to every eye that has ever stood in front of it, is another painting entirely. A face. A woman, her head turned slightly, rendered in colors that belong to a completely different Van Gogh, painted 2 years earlier in a different country, in a palette so dark it shares almost nothing with the grass and flowers now covering it. The painting you can see and the painting that is actually there are not the same object, and for more than 100 years, nobody knew the second one existed at all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Before he ever set foot in Paris, Van Gogh spent 2 difficult years in Nuenen, a small village in the Dutch province of North Brabant, living at his parents' parsonage and working out of a converted shed that served as his studio. It was there, through 1884 and into 1885, that he trained himself, almost by brute repetition, to paint peasants. Not a single sketch and not a single study for a single canvas, but the same subject returned to again and again, until he had produced somewhere close to 40 individual studies of peasant heads, weavers at their looms, and cramped cottage interiors, each one an attempt to get nearer to something he described in his letters to his brother Theo as the true color of a peasant's life. He wanted the people in his paintings to look as though the same soil that grew their potatoes had also formed their faces. His palette in this period was built almost entirely from browns, ochres, dull greens, and a near black he mixed by hand, rather than bought ready-made from a shop, and he was proud of how far he had managed to push it. When he finally assembled everything he had learned into the potato eaters in the spring of 1885, he told Theo in a letter that he wanted the painting to smell of bacon fat, smoke, and boiled potatoes steaming on a plate. It is a dark, dense, unglamorous painting on purpose, and it represents the endpoint of everything Van Gogh had spent 2 years practicing toward. He believed, rightly or wrongly, that it was the first real proof of what he was capable of as a painter. Van Gogh's father, Joris, a Dutch Reformed pastor, died suddenly in March of 1885, only weeks before the Potato Eaters was finished, and the two men had spent much of the Nuenen period in open conflict over Vincent's decision to abandon a conventional career for painting. The peasant studies he produced in that shed were, among other things, an argument he was making to himself about whether the choice had been worth it. When the Potato Eaters was finally shown to people outside his immediate circle, the response was not the vindication he had hoped for. Anton van Rappard, a painter friend Van Gogh corresponded with regularly, wrote back with a blunt and fairly harsh critique of the drawing and proportions in the figures, a letter that strained the friendship for a period afterward. Van Gogh defended the painting in his own letters to Theo, insisting he had deliberately chosen roughness over polish because polish would have lied about the lives the painting was depicting. Still, the muted reception stung, and it did not fade quickly. Whatever confidence the Potato Eaters gave him privately, it did not translate into recognition beyond a small circle of correspondence. And by the end of 1885, with his father gone and his standing in the village more complicated than admired, Van Gogh had reasons beyond simple ambition to leave Nuenen behind entirely. Then, in February of 1886, nearly everything he had built in Nuenen was set aside within a matter of months. Van Gogh moved to Paris to live with Theo, who worked as an art dealer for the firm Boussaud, Valadon and Company, and the city gave him access to something the Dutch countryside had never offered, the Impressionists, working in real time, still exhibiting new paintings, still arguing about them in cafes he could actually walk into and sit down at. He saw canvases by Monet, Pissarro, and Sisley built from broken color and quick, visible touches of paint, and he met younger painters experimenting with the even more systematic color theory that would come to be called pointillism, Paul Signac among them. Within months, his own palette began to shift, and the shift was not gradual. The browns and near blacks of Nuenen gave way to violet, cobalt blue, chrome yellow, and pure, largely unmixed color laid down in short parallel strokes. Van Gogh himself noticed how sharp the break was even as it was happening. In a letter written not long after he arrived, he told Theo he was trying to get more color into his work, more sun. Paris achieved that in under a year, which is a remarkably short window for a painter to unlearn a palette he had spent 2 full years constructing from nothing. Theo's position at Boussaud, Valadon and Company gave Vincent something more valuable than a place to sleep. The gallery's branch on the Boulevard Montmartre exhibited progressive painters when the more conservative branch would not, and through Theo, Vincent gained access to canvases and conversations he could never have reached from Nuenen. He struck up a friendship with Émile Bernard, then still a teenager, at Fernand Cormon's studio, where both men had enrolled for formal instruction that neither particularly respected, but that put them in the same room as other young painters testing the same ideas. He crossed paths with Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, and more briefly, with Camille Pissarro, whose own experiments with divided color and small systematic brushstrokes fed directly into what Van Gogh was starting to try on his own canvases. He bought paint on credit from Julien Tanguy, a supplier known among younger painters for extending patience to artists who could not pay on time, and he spent hours in the shop of the dealer Siegfried Bing, sorting through stacks of Japanese woodblock prints, buying what he could afford and studying the rest, absorbing the flattened perspective and cropped, close-in compositions that would surface directly in paintings like Patch of Grass a year later. Self-portraiture became, in this period, less a matter of vanity than of economy. Unable to consistently afford models, Van Gogh painted his own face more than 20 times during his 2 years in Paris, and each version reads almost like a dated entry in a color notebook, one experiment after another, in how a single familiar subject could be rebuilt using violet shadow, stippled color, or a flat field of unbroken chrome yellow. None of this came without cost, and Van Gogh had almost no independent income of his own the entire time he was painting seriously. Theo supported him financially for most of his adult life, sending a monthly allowance that rarely covered paint, canvas, models, and rent in the same month, and Van Gogh's letters from this period return constantly to the price of materials. Canvas was expensive, and a painter working as quickly and as constantly as Van Gogh did, sometimes finishing an entire composition in a single sitting, could go through a stretched canvas in a matter of days rather than weeks. Like a number of painters working under similar financial pressure before and after him, Van Gogh did not always start with a blank surface. He reused old canvases, painting new compositions directly over work he had already completed, occasionally turning the canvas 90 degrees or flipping it upside down first, sometimes simply covering the earlier paint layer without scraping any of it away. It was a practical decision forced by circumstance, not an artistic statement, and there is no evidence Van Gogh ever imagined anyone would need to know about it. In the summer of 1887, working in the parks of Asnières, on the northwestern edge of Paris, where he and his friend Émile Bernard painted side by side, Van Gogh produced a small group of close, tightly cropped studies of grass, wildflowers, and undergrowth, paintings that owe an obvious debt to the close focus compositions he had been studying for months in Japanese woodblock prints. One of these became Patch of Grass. For well over a century, that was the entire story anyone could tell about this particular painting. A quick study, made in a park, during a productive and increasingly confident stretch of Van Gogh's early years in the city. What nobody could tell simply by looking was what sat underneath it. Oil paint is not transparent the way glass is, but it is not entirely opaque either, especially as it ages, and conservators have long known that a ghost image, the underlying shape of a reused canvas, can occasionally show through under raking light or careful visual inspection, a phenomenon called pentimento when it involves an artist's own second thoughts on the same composition. Patch of Grass gave up nothing of the kind. Its surface remained, to the naked eye and even under standard infrared photography, a closed and confident record of a single finished painting. It sat in the Kröller-Müller Museum's collection for decades, catalogued, exhibited, and reproduced without ever being flagged as a candidate for anything unusual. Infrared reflectography, the tool conservators normally rely on to look for underdrawing beneath a paint layer, can see through pigment to a meaningful degree, but it depends on contrast in how different materials absorb infrared light, and it is far better suited to picking out a sketched line of carbon-based drawing material than resolving a second, fully realized oil painting done in an entirely different, non-carbon-based palette. Whatever sat beneath the grass and flowers had effectively hidden itself from every tool available to an art historian for more than a century. It would take a piece of scientific infrastructure that has nothing to do with art at all to finally see through it. That instrument arrived in the form of a synchrotron, a particle accelerator normally used by physicists and chemists to study the atomic structure of materials, housed at the DESI Research Center in Hamburg, Germany. In 2008, a team led by Joris, a conservation scientist then working at Delft University of Technology, and Koen Janssens, a chemist at the University of Antwerp, brought Patch of Grass to the synchrotron facility, not to look at the painting Van Gogh intended anyone to see, but to look straight through it. Their method, a technique called synchrotron radiation-based X-ray fluorescence mapping, works by firing an intensely focused beam of X-rays at a single point on the canvas and reading the specific wavelengths of light that come back, wavelengths that correspond to individual chemical elements in the paint, regardless of whether that paint sits on the surface or several layers beneath it. Moving that beam across the canvas one point at a time, the team could build, element by element, a complete map of every pigment Van Gogh had ever applied to that stretch of fabric, including the ones he had painted over, and every reasonable person would have assumed were gone for good. Nobody involved in the project expected to find a hidden Van Gogh underneath it. The scan was originally conceived as a technical study of his materials, a way of understanding how his paint had aged and shifted in color since the 1880s, which remains a real and ongoing concern for museums holding his work, since several of the pigments Van Gogh favored are known to fade or discolor over time. Mapping mercury, antimony, and other heavy elements across the canvas was meant to answer questions about the surface paint alone. What the scans returned instead was something nobody on the project had scheduled for. Beneath the green and ochre of the grass, in a pattern that had no relationship to any blade or flower visible on the surface, the mercury and antimony readings began to resolve into a shape, a rounded form, distinct from the vegetation above it, something with an outline that looked less like a leaf and more like a head. It took time and a considerable amount of computational processing to turn scattered elemental readings into anything resembling an image, but when the team finally assembled the data into a coherent map, the shape sharpened into something unmistakable. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Ordinary X-ray radiography, the kind museums have used on paintings since early in the 20th century, works by measuring how much radiation different materials block, and it is very good at revealing shapes built from lead white, a pigment so dense it shows up almost regardless of what has been painted over it. That older method had already told conservators that a number of Van Gogh's canvases carried earlier compositions underneath, because the dense lead white in his early paint frequently produced a faint but readable silhouette under a standard X-ray. What conventional radiography could not do was tell those silhouettes apart in any detail or say anything about color, since it collapses every pigment down to a single measure of density. A shape was visible, a face was not. Synchrotron radiation-based X-ray fluorescence changes what is possible because it does not simply ask how dense a given point on the canvas is, it asks which specific elements are present at that point and in what concentration, effectively fingerprinting the pigment itself. Mercury signals vermilion. Antimony, paired with lead, signals the yellow used in certain flesh tones and highlights. Cobalt signals blue. By scanning the same physical spot across a range of these signatures and layering the results, the Delft and Antwerp team were not simply detecting the presence of an earlier painting the way a standard X-ray might. They were reconstructing an approximate sense of what colors that earlier painting had actually used, translating an invisible chemical signal back into something closer to an image than a shadow. What the synchrotron had found was a portrait, a woman's head and upper shoulders, turned very slightly away from the viewer, rendered not in the bright greens and yellows of the grass above her, but in the same dark, earthy register Van Gogh had spent 2 years perfecting in Nuenen. The mercury readings, concentrated in the region corresponding to her face, pointed to vermilion and other mercury-based reds, mixed into flesh tones, the way Van Gogh mixed them during his Dutch period. The distribution of the pigments matched, closely, the technique he used in his known studies of peasant women from 1884 and 1885, the same 40 or so heads he had produced in preparation for the potato eaters. Comparing the reconstructed shape against Van Gogh's surviving Nuenen studies, several of which show peasant women wearing the plain white caps typical of Brabant farm dress, Researchers noted the general similarity in pose and framing, a close, three-quarter view cropped tightly around the head and shoulders in the same manner Van Gogh used across that entire series. None of this amounts to a positive identification. The elemental map produced by the synchrotron scan is not a photograph, and no amount of processing turns X-ray fluorescence data into the kind of fine detail a conservator could use to match a face against another painting the way a portrait specialist might. What it offers instead is a silhouette built from chemistry, confident about the presence of a head, a shoulder line, and a concentration of flesh-toned pigment where a face would sit, but necessarily vague about individual features. That vagueness has not stopped the museum, and the researchers who conducted the original study from treating the find as conclusive on the question that matters most for how the painting should be understood. Not precisely who she was, but what she represents materially. A physical fragment of the exact body of work Van Gogh built his early identity as a painter around, buried directly beneath a painting that represents the identity he built to replace it. Art historians who examined the reconstructed image afterward were careful about how far the evidence could actually take them. They could not say with certainty who this particular woman was, whether she was a specific named sitter or a composite study of the kind Van Gogh routinely produced and set aside, and the museum has never claimed otherwise. What they could say, with considerably more confidence, was that the painting beneath Patch of Grass belonged unmistakably to the Nuenen period, both in subject and in the physical chemistry of its paint, and that Van Gogh had carried this particular canvas, whether finished or unfinished, out of the Netherlands, across the border into France and into a rented room in Paris, where he eventually turned it into something else without a second thought for what he was covering. That detail is the one that reorganizes everything else about how this small, previously unremarkable painting should be read. Art historians had always described the shift from Nuenen to Paris using letters, exhibition records, and stylistic comparison between paintings that were physically separate objects. One dark canvas of peasants sitting in one collection, one bright canvas of grass sitting in another, connected only by argument and by the paper trail Van Gogh left behind in his correspondence with Theo. Patch of Grass collapses that separation onto a single rectangle of woven fabric. The same canvas that carried a somber, Nuenen-era face in 1885 was, less than 2 years later, carrying a fast, sunlit, distinctly Parisian study of grass and wildflowers, and Van Gogh painted the second version directly on top of the first, without removing it, without transforming it, simply burying it under a different set of decisions about color and light. Every argument art historians have made about how sharply and how quickly Van Gogh changed as a painter after Paris is present, physically, in the paint layers of this one object. The dark peasant woman is not a separate painting that happens to share a subject with his Nuenen work. She is the literal foundation the Parisian grass was painted on top of, close enough beneath the surface that a beam of X-rays could still read the shape of her face more than 120 years later. There is a further layer to what the discovery reveals, one that has less to do with color theory and more to do with circumstance. Reusing a canvas is not, on its own, a remarkable fact about Van Gogh. Conservators working with technical imaging have identified similar reuse in a number of his early paintings, evidence that this was a habit rather than an isolated decision, a consequence of the financial strain that followed him for most of his working life. What makes Patch of Grass unusual is not that Van Gogh painted over an old canvas, it is which old canvas he chose and what that choice suggests about how he regarded his own earlier work once he had moved past it. He did not paint over a failed experiment or a technical exercise he was embarrassed by. He painted over a study connected to the exact period and the exact subject matter he had considered, only 2 years earlier, proof of his seriousness as an artist. By 1887, having absorbed Impressionism and Pointillism and having rebuilt his palette almost from the ground up, Van Gogh appears to have treated that earlier, harder-won achievement as material, something to be covered rather than preserved. It is a small, almost accidental piece of evidence about how completely he had moved on, and how little sentimentality he attached to work that, in hindsight, forms the foundation of everything that came after it. The discovery also raised a quieter, more uncomfortable question inside the museum world, one that has nothing to do with Van Gogh specifically. If a painting as heavily studied and as frequently exhibited as Patch of Grass could carry a completely undetected portrait for more than 100 years, the natural next question is, how many other canvases, by other painters, in other collections, are carrying something similar? Museums do not routinely run synchrotron scans on their holdings. The facilities are rare, the beam time is expensive, and heavily booked by physicists and chemists working on projects that have nothing to do with art, and a painting has to be a strong enough candidate, usually because of a suspicious X-ray shadow or a well-documented history of financial hardship on the part of the artist, before a museum will invest the effort to bring it to a facility like Deci. Van Gogh's biography made Patch of Grass a natural candidate once the question was even asked, since his poverty during the Paris years is extensively documented in his own letters. Painters whose financial situations are less thoroughly recorded may never receive the same scrutiny, not because their work is any less likely to hide something, but because nobody has a strong enough reason to look for it. The Kröller-Müller case has become something close to a proof of concept within conservation science, cited in later studies as evidence that even a well-catalogued, frequently exhibited painting from an extensively documented artist can still conceal information nobody thought to search for. The technical side of the discovery did not stop with the initial 2008 scan. Researchers involved in the project, and others who followed the work in the years afterward, continued refining the imaging techniques used to read hidden paint layers in Van Gogh's canvases, improving the resolution of the elemental maps, and sharpening the ability to distinguish between pigments that produce similar X-ray signatures. Later analysis added detail to the reconstructed face that the earliest scans could only suggest in outline, strengthening the sense of a specific individual woman rather than a generalized shape. None of this later work has overturned the central finding. If anything, it has reinforced it, confirming through additional data what the first synchrotron scan proposed, almost by accident, while looking for something else entirely. What makes this particular case matter beyond Van Gogh's own catalogue is what it demonstrates about the limits of looking. Patch of Grass was examined, described, and reproduced for well over 100 years by people whose entire professional training was built around close observation of exactly this kind of object. Curators studied its brushwork. Conservators handled it during cleaning and reframing. Scholars compared it against other Parisian studies from the same summer. Every tool available to that discipline, the naked eye, raking light, standard infrared photography, returned the same answer. A single, complete painting of grass and flowers, nothing more. The face underneath was not hiding behind some deliberate act of concealment on Van Gogh's part. He was not trying to disguise anything. The face was simply beneath the visible threshold of every method anyone had access to until a machine built to study the atomic structure of unrelated materials happened to be pointed at it. Standing in front of Patch of Grass today, knowing what the painting actually contains, changes very little about what the eye can register and almost everything about what the mind understands it is looking at. The grass is still grass. The yellow flowers still catch the light the way they were always going to catch it. Nothing on the surface has changed and nothing ever will, since removing the top layer to expose the peasant woman beneath it would destroy a finished Van Gogh painting in order to reveal an unfinished fragment of an earlier one, a trade no museum would ever make. But the object itself is no longer a single, quiet study from a productive summer in Paris. It is two paintings sharing one surface, separated by roughly 2 years, one country, and an almost total transformation in how Van Gogh understood color, sitting on top of each other, in a way that makes the transformation itself something closer to physical fact than art historical argument. Patch of Grass remains in the collection of the Kröller-Müller Museum in Otterlo, hanging as it has for decades, still catalogued as a small landscape study from the summer of 1887. Visitors who stop in front of it see exactly what visitors have always seen, a vast, sunlit patch of grass and wildflowers, with no obvious claim on their attention beyond the artist's name attached to the frame. What has changed is not the painting, it is the record of what the painting is actually made of, a record that now includes a second image that will never be visible to a viewer standing in the gallery, no matter how long they look, no matter how much they already know. The synchrotron scan exists as data, as a reconstructed elemental map published for other researchers rather than hung on a wall, and that is the only place the peasant woman beneath the grass will ever be seen clearly again. She survives as evidence rather than as an image, present in the museum's holdings, but absent from anything a visitor's eye can register directly. A woman Van Gogh once studied for weeks in a shed in Brabant, now visible only to instruments built for an entirely different purpose. There is something almost unbearably literal about what this means for how the painting should be understood. Most artists' evolution is described in the abstract, a matter of style shifting from one period to the next, documented through side-by-side comparison of separate canvases hung in separate rooms, sometimes in separate countries. Van Gogh's case removes that abstraction entirely. Here, the evolution is not a comparison between two objects, it is a single object. One continuous piece of canvas and stretcher bars that traveled with him from a shed in Brabant to a rented room in Paris, carrying its Nuenen self forward, even as its Parisian self was being painted directly on top of it. The woman under the grass did not stay behind when Van Gogh left the Netherlands. She crossed the border with him, folded among his other unused canvases, present for every mile of a transition art historians usually describe, as if it happened between one painting and the next, rather than within the literal boundaries of one. There is a kind of unintentional honesty in that. Van Gogh was not trying to make a statement about continuity or rupture when he painted over her. He needed a canvas, and she was the canvas he had available. But the result, found by accident more than a century later, using equipment built for an entirely different branch of science, ended up saying more about how completely and how physically Van Gogh broke from his own earlier work than any letter he wrote at the time. He told Theo, in words, that he wanted more color, more sun. The synchrotron showed, in element maps rather than sentences, exactly how far he was willing to go to get it, up to and including painting directly over the woman who had once represented everything he believed he was capable of. Visitors to the Kröller-Müller Museum will likely keep walking past patch of grass the way visitors always have, drawn instead toward the wheat fields and the self-portraits and the sunflowers that made Van Gogh famous in the first place. Nothing about the object itself asks for their attention. It remains a modest, quick, sunlit study of a summer afternoon in a park outside Paris, exactly as it has always presented itself. The next time this painting comes up in a conversation about Van Gogh, it is worth remembering what actually sits inside its frame. A study of grass, made quickly and confidently during one of the most productive stretches of his short career, resting directly on top of the darker, harder period that came before it, the one he once believed was the first real proof of what he could do. Both versions of the artist are still there, on the same canvas, one visible to anyone who walks into the room, and one readable only in data collected more than a century after he set down his brush, and neither one erases the other. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.